Don't get in that car. The homeless boy's voice cracked across the busy Philadelphia street, just as billionaire Jonathan Mercer reached for the handle of his black limousine. 11-year-old Phoenix Price stood barefoot on the cold pavement, clutching an old brass firefighter's whistle so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The security guards grabbed him before he could get any closer, while impatient drivers honked behind them. Jonathan frowned, convinced the child wanted money. But Phoenix never asked for a single dollar. He only whispered, "Please, not today." Less than 2 minutes later, police cruisers, fire engines, and utility trucks stormed the block. Officers sealed off the entire street as alarms echoed through the morning air. Before we uncover why one forgotten child saw what everyone else missed, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if stories about courage, kindness, and second chances mean something to you, I'd love to have you join us for this journey. 3 days earlier, long before police sirens echoed through downtown Philadelphia, the city had already begun whispering its warning. It simply chose the wrong audience. At exactly 5:15 every morning, before the first commuter train rumbled across the Schuylkill River, and before coffee shops unlocked their doors, 11-year-old Phoenix Price was already awake. His alarm wasn't a phone. It was his grandfather's cough. The sound came in waves from the narrow cot across the shelter room, deep, ragged, and stubborn, as though every breath had to fight its way through years of smoke and memories. Phoenix sat up immediately. He never waited for the coughing to stop. It never really did. "You okay, Grandpa?" he asked softly. Walter Price forced a smile before reaching for the inhaler resting on the milk crate beside his bed. "I've been worse," he lied. Phoenix knew better. The old man had once carried firefighters out of burning buildings. Now climbing 3 steps to the shelter entrance left him breathless. Chronic lung disease had slowly stolen the strength from the broad-shouldered firefighter who had once seemed larger than life. Still, Walter refused to complain. He believed complaints wasted energy better spent helping someone else. Phoenix folded his thin blanket with military precision before helping his grandfather prepare for the day. He filled a chipped paper cup with water handed over the morning medication, then carefully buttoned Walter's faded flannel shirt. The old man looked at his grandson with quiet pride. "You never forget the little things." "You taught me not to," Walter chuckled. "The little things save lives." Those words had become as ordinary as sunrise. Outside, the July air already carried the warmth of another humid Philadelphia morning. Delivery trucks rolled through narrow streets, while sanitation crews emptied dumpsters behind restaurants. Phoenix adjusted the worn backpack on his shoulders and slipped the old brass firefighter's whistle into his front pocket. He never left without it. Its surface had turned dull over the decades scratched by countless emergencies and countless years. The engraving was almost impossible to read now. Philadelphia Fire Department. Engine Company 18. Walter had carried it during every shift until retirement. Now it belonged to Phoenix. Not because it was valuable, because it reminded him that warning people mattered even when nobody wanted to listen. The shelter served breakfast at 6:30, but Phoenix rarely stayed long enough to eat inside. Instead, he wrapped 2 slices of toast inside a napkin and walked several blocks toward Mrs. Gloria Jenkins' pretzel cart. Gloria had occupied the same corner for almost 25 years. She insisted the city smelled different before 7 in the morning. "Before the traffic covers everything," she always said. She spotted Phoenix crossing the street. "Morning sunshine." She called every child Sunshine. Phoenix smiled. "Morning, Miss Gloria." Without being asked, he began arranging boxes beneath the cart while Gloria mixed fresh dough. "Your grandpa coughing again?" "A little. A little means a lot with him." Phoenix nodded. "I know." She quietly slipped an extra warm pretzel into a paper bag. "For Walter." "I can pay later." You already did. When? You showed up. That was how Gloria spoke. As if kindness was simply another ingredient in breakfast, Phoenix accepted the pretzel with both hands. He hated charity. Gloria understood that. So she never called it charity. She called it breakfast between neighbors. By 7:30, the sidewalks were alive. Construction workers carried coffee cups larger than their tool belts. Office employees hurried past with wireless earbuds. Tourists searched maps they barely understood. Phoenix watched everyone. Not because he was curious, because Walter had trained him that way. Most people only see what's moving, his grandfather often said. A firefighter learns to notice what suddenly stops moving. Phoenix watched leaking pipes, traffic lights, steam vents, broken bricks, cracked pavement, birds, dogs, people's faces, patterns. Everything told a story. Most people were simply too busy to read it. Across the city, Jonathan Mercer began his day very differently. At precisely 7 o'clock, sunlight poured through the glass walls of his penthouse overlooking Center City. His calendar had already filled every minute until nearly midnight. Breakfast meeting, investor conference, television interview, groundbreaking ceremony, board presentation, dinner with city officials. Every hour represented another decision involving millions of dollars. Jonathan tied his navy tie while listening to financial reports through a wireless earpiece. Emily Carter, his executive assistant, walked beside him as they entered the private elevator. The council approved tomorrow's inspection schedule. Good. The groundbreaking ceremony remains on time. Good. The media confirmed attendance. Excellent. She hesitated. There are still several community complaints regarding the South Market redevelopment. Jonathan barely looked up. Were they reviewed? They were marked resolved. Then move on. Emily made a note. She trusted the reports. Jonathan trusted the system. Neither realized both were wrong. South Market redevelopment had become the company's showcase project, a modern commercial district, underground infrastructure replacement, affordable housing, new retail space. The city called it renewal. Investors called it opportunity. Residents simply called it home. Late that afternoon, Phoenix wandered through those same streets collecting aluminum cans from public recycling bins. The neighborhood fascinated him. Old brick buildings stood beside shiny construction fences. Workers drilled beneath the sidewalks. Yellow excavators rested like sleeping dinosaurs. Phoenix paused. Something felt different. He couldn't explain why. Not yet. He crouched beside a storm drain. Water usually trickled steadily beneath the grate. Today the sound seemed strangely hollow, almost distant. A city bus rolled past. He watched tiny ripples spread across a puddle near the curb, then disappear. He looked toward the construction site. Nothing appeared obviously wrong. Still, something refused to settle inside him. A flock of pigeons suddenly lifted into the air all at once from an empty section of sidewalk. Phoenix followed them with his eyes. They didn't return. He frowned. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe. But Walter always said the first warning rarely looked like a warning. Phoenix slipped the empty soda cans deeper into his backpack before taking one last glance at the fenced construction zone. Far beyond the barriers hidden beneath layers of asphalt and concrete, the city was quietly preparing a secret that would soon stop traffic silence an entire street and place a homeless boy directly in the path of one of America's most powerful businessmen. Phoenix didn't know exactly what was coming. He only knew the city had begun speaking, and he was one of the very few who had started listening. The next morning began like every other morning. At least that was what most people believed. Philadelphia moved with practiced rhythm. Coffee machines hissed inside corner cafes. Delivery vans blocked narrow alleys while restaurant workers stacked boxes of vegetables outside their kitchens. Cyclists weaved between buses and construction crews, wearing fluorescent orange vests, slowly gathered around the South Market redevelopment site. To thousands of people, it looked like another ordinary Tuesday. To Phoenix Price, it felt wrong before the sun had fully climbed above the rooftops. He noticed it before he reached Gloria Jenkins' pretzel cart. The pigeons were gone. Normally, dozens of gray birds crowded the sidewalk every morning, pecking at crumbs left behind from the previous evening. Gloria often joked they were her earliest customers. Today, the pavement was empty. Phoenix stopped walking. He looked up toward the old church roof where the birds usually gathered before sunrise. Nothing. Only silence. Gloria saw him staring. "What are you looking at, Sunshine?" "The pigeons." She glanced around. "Huh. I didn't even notice. They're always here. Maybe somebody scared them. Maybe." But Phoenix didn't sound convinced. He helped Gloria unfold the umbrella over the cart before quietly looking toward the construction fencing across the intersection. The machines hadn't started yet. Even so, he caught another strange detail. A faint odor drifted through the humid air. Not strong, barely noticeable, almost sweet, almost metallic. He inhaled again. Gas. Not enough for most people to recognize. Enough for Walter to have taught him years ago. Never ignore a smell that suddenly appears where it never belonged. Gloria wrinkled her nose. "You smell something." Phoenix nodded. "Just a little." She sniffed once more before shrugging. "I can't smell anything except pretzels." He didn't answer. Walter always said older lungs sometimes forgot what danger smelled like. Children often noticed first. Phoenix finished helping Gloria tuck the few dollars she paid him into his backpack and crossed toward the redevelopment project. Temporary fencing surrounded nearly half the block. Excavators rested beside stacks of concrete pipes. Workers carried blueprints from one trailer to another, while forklifts beeped in reverse. Everything appeared organized. Everything appeared safe. That was exactly what bothered him. He walked slowly beside the fence, pretending to study the discarded soda cans lying along the curb. Instead, he watched the ground. Every few seconds, a barely visible vibration traveled through a crack in the asphalt. Not large enough to shake parked cars, just enough to disturb a puddle collected beside the storm drain. Tiny circles spread across the water, then stopped. A city bus rolled past. Again, the puddle trembled, but this time the ripples continued several seconds after the bus disappeared. Phoenix crouched. He placed 2 fingertips lightly against the pavement. Cold, slightly damp, then a faint pulse, almost like someone knocking from very far underground. His heart beat faster. Behind the fence, workers began operating a concrete saw. Its loud scream filled the street. No one else would ever hear the quieter sounds beneath it. A young engineer carrying a tablet stepped out of the site office. His name badge read Noah Bennett. He looked exhausted. Dark circles framed his eyes as though sleep had abandoned him days earlier. Phoenix watched Noah stop beside an open utility access panel. The engineer frowned. He leaned down, looked inside, then quickly stood again. He glanced around before writing something on his tablet. His expression wasn't fear, it was uncertainty. The kind adults tried hard to hide. Phoenix remembered Walter saying that experienced firefighters never panicked first. They became unusually quiet. Noah looked exactly like that. Just then, a pickup truck entered the site. Brian Keller climbed out wearing a spotless white hard hat that somehow never collected dust. Even from across the street, his voice carried authority. "We're already behind schedule." Noah answered carefully. "I think we should inspect line 4 again." Brian barely slowed his stride. "It passed yesterday." "I know, but it passed. There was unusual pressure this morning." Brian sighed loudly. You engineers always find something? I'm serious. So am I. Brian lowered his voice, but Phoenix was close enough to catch fragments. The mayor's office is coming. The investors are coming. The CEO is coming. We're not stopping work because of guesses. Noah hesitated. They're not guesses. Brian stared at him. Finish your report. Then he walked away. Noah remained standing beside the utility opening for several long seconds before reluctantly returning to work. Phoenix's stomach tightened. Adults rarely argued quietly unless something mattered. He continued walking. Near the corner, he found another clue. A heavy cast-iron manhole cover sat slightly crooked, only an inch. Most pedestrians stepped over it without noticing. Phoenix knelt beside it. Fresh scrape marks surrounded its edge, as if pressure beneath had pushed it upward. He reached toward it. A security guard immediately shouted, "Hey!" Phoenix stood. "No touching." "I wasn't. Move along." The guard approached, already annoyed. "This isn't a playground." "I just wanted to—" "I said move." Phoenix backed away. "I'm sorry." The guard pointed towards the opposite sidewalk. "Go collect cans somewhere else." Several workers glanced briefly toward the exchange before returning to their jobs. To them, he was simply another homeless kid wandering too close to expensive equipment. Invisible, harmless, easy to dismiss. Phoenix crossed the street without arguing. Walter had taught him another lesson. Sometimes being ignored taught you more than being welcomed. Across from the site stood an aging brick apartment building. An elderly woman struggled with grocery bags near the entrance. Phoenix hurried over. "May I help?" She smiled gratefully. "Oh, sweetheart, thank you." He carried the bags upstairs to the second floor. When he returned outside, the smell had grown stronger. Still subtle, still easy to miss, but unmistakably there. Gas. He looked toward the construction fence again. A utility worker walked past holding a handheld detector. The device emitted one brief chirp. The worker glanced down, pressed a button. The sound stopped. Then he kept walking. Phoenix frowned. That wasn't right. Even from a distance, something about the man's hurried movement felt rehearsed, as if the warning had been inconvenient rather than important. He searched the sky again. Still no pigeons. Even the squirrels that usually darted across the park fence had disappeared into the trees. Nature had quietly changed its behavior. The city hadn't. Phoenix reached into his pocket and wrapped his fingers around Walter's brass whistle. Its cool metal steadied him. He could almost hear his grandfather's calm voice. Most people only notice emergencies after the sirens begin. A firefighter learns to notice everything before the sirens. Phoenix looked once more at the fenced construction zone, at the workers pretending everything was normal, at Brian Keller, confidently directing equipment, and at Noah Bennett, repeatedly glancing toward the underground access hatch with growing concern. He still couldn't explain exactly what was wrong, but the uneasy feeling inside him had become something much heavier than instinct. It had become certainty. And for the first time in his young life, Phoenix realized that seeing danger before everyone else could become its own kind of burden. That evening, rain arrived without warning. Not a violent summer storm, just a steady drizzle that turned sidewalks glossy and filled the city with reflections of red traffic lights and yellow storefront windows. Phoenix hurried through the wet streets with 2 paper bags tucked carefully beneath his jacket. One held day-old bread Gloria had insisted he take. The other contained discounted vegetable soup from a church kitchen that closed every Wednesday evening. He pushed open the shelter door just before 7. Warm air mixed with the familiar scent of disinfectant coffee and damp coats. Walter Price sat beside the window, wrapped in his old navy blanket. He was studying a weathered notebook with pages that had turned the color of old newspaper. When Phoenix entered, the old man smiled immediately. "You're late." Miss Gloria had extra customers. That's a good problem. Phoenix placed the soup on the small folding table. And I found carrots. Walter looked inside the bag. You negotiated again. They were throwing them away. So you rescued vegetables? Phoenix laughed. They still count. Walter nodded approvingly. A firefighter hates waste. They shared the simple meal slowly. Walter always insisted they eat without rushing. Food deserves respect, he often said. After dinner, the shelter grew quieter. Some residents watched television while others prepared their beds. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Phoenix noticed Walter rubbing his chest between coughs. Worse today? A little. You've said that every day. Walter sighed. I'm running out of new answers. Phoenix lowered his eyes. If we had enough money, Walter interrupted gently. We have enough. No. We have enough to be grateful. Phoenix looked unconvinced. Walter reached beneath his cot and pulled out a dented green metal toolbox. The paint had chipped away over decades, revealing patches of bare steel underneath. He placed it carefully on the table. I think it's time. Phoenix recognized the box immediately. Walter almost never opened it. Inside rested photographs, service medals, newspaper clippings, and a handful of objects from another lifetime. Walter lifted each item with surprising tenderness. A black and white photograph of young firefighters standing beside Engine Company 18, a leather helmet shield cracked down one side, a melted wristwatch recovered after a warehouse fire. Finally wrapped inside an old cotton handkerchief lay the brass whistle Phoenix carried every day. Walter smiled. You know why I gave this to you? Phoenix nodded. It belonged to you. Walter shook his head. No. It belonged to responsibility. He picked it up. Rain tapped louder against the glass. This whistle isn't for calling attention to yourself. It calls attention to danger. Phoenix listened quietly. Walter turned the whistle over in his hand. When I was 28, we answered a fire at an apartment building on North Broad Street. He paused. There was smoke everywhere. Everyone was yelling. My captain kept telling us the building was stable. Phoenix had heard pieces of this story before, never all of it. Walter continued. Outside the building stood a little girl, maybe 9 years old. She kept screaming that the back staircase was cracking. But nobody listened. Why? Because she was a child. Walter looked toward the rain. They assumed she was frightened. Weren't they? They were. But she was also right. Silence filled the room. The staircase collapsed less than 3 minutes later. Phoenix swallowed. Did anyone? Walter nodded slowly. We lost 2 firefighters. His voice barely rose above a whisper. And the little girl's father. Phoenix stared at the whistle. I never forgot her face. Walter gently placed the whistle into his grandson's palm. That day taught me something no academy ever could. He closed Phoenix's fingers around the cool brass. When people stop listening. Phoenix finished the sentence with him. Don't stop warning. Walter smiled. Exactly. They may ignore you. They may laugh. They may tell you to leave. But if your heart knows someone is in danger, he tapped the whistle lightly, you speak anyway. Across the city, Jonathan Mercer stood before a wall-sized digital presentation inside Mercer Urban Development headquarters. Executives filled the conference room. Architectural renderings glowed on massive screens. Tomorrow's groundbreaking ceremony had become the company's biggest public event of the year. Brian Keller clicked to another slide. Construction remains on schedule. Jonathan folded his arms. Safety inspections. Completed. Utility systems. Verified. Gas lines. Within acceptable limits. Brian answered without hesitation. Emily Carter quietly typed notes beside Jonathan. Everything sounded polished, organized, professional, exactly as investors expected. Then, a younger engineer raised his hand. Jonathan recognized him from previous project reviews. Noah Bennett. Yes. Noah cleared his throat. I believe we should conduct one additional underground pressure inspection before Friday. Brian's smile disappeared almost instantly. The engineering review has already been signed. I understand. But we've had inconsistent readings near Section 4. Brian spoke before Jonathan could respond. The fluctuations were minimal. They're becoming more frequent. They remain within tolerance. Noah hesitated. I'd still recommend another inspection. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Jonathan studied the charts on the screen. Everything appeared normal. No red warning indicators, no emergency reports, no highlighted concerns, only numbers. Brian spoke calmly. A new inspection would delay tomorrow's media schedule. The mayor has already confirmed attendance. So have investors. Jonathan looked toward Noah. Do you believe there's immediate danger? Noah opened his mouth, then glanced briefly toward Brian. The hesitation lasted only a second. Can't prove it. Jonathan nodded once. Then continue monitoring. Brian moved immediately to the next slide. The meeting continued. No one noticed Noah slowly lowering his eyes toward the conference table. No one except Emily. As everyone stood to leave, she caught Noah gathering his documents. You don't seem convinced. He forced a small smile. Engineers worry for a living. Is that all? He looked back toward the closed conference room doors. I hope so. Emily watched him walk away. For reasons she couldn't explain, his answer stayed with her. Later that night, Phoenix and Walter sat near the shelter window, watching raindrops race down the glass. The old man suddenly pointed outside. What do you hear? Phoenix listened. Rain. What else? A bus. Distant traffic. Walter nodded. And underneath? Phoenix closed his eyes. For several seconds he heard nothing unusual. Then, a low rumble. Not thunder, not traffic, a vibration, almost too deep to notice. His eyes opened. Walter smiled faintly. You heard it? What is it? I don't know. But cities breathe. They groan. They settle. They warn. He looked at his grandson with quiet seriousness. Most people stop listening once they're told everything is safe. Phoenix instinctively wrapped his fingers around the brass whistle in his pocket. Outside, the rain continued washing the streets clean. Far beneath those streets, hidden beneath layers of asphalt concrete and steel invisible pressure, continued building in complete silence. And somewhere in the darkness below Philadelphia, time had already begun counting down. Thursday arrived, wrapped in unusually heavy air. By 6:10 a.m., the humidity already clung to the streets like a damp blanket. The forecast called for clear skies, yet the city felt strangely muted, as if Philadelphia itself were holding its breath. Phoenix Price noticed the silence before he noticed anything else. The morning rush had begun on schedule. Buses hissed to a stop, commuters hurried across intersections with coffee in hand, and construction vehicles lined up outside the South Market redevelopment site. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded almost normal. Almost. Walter had always said that dangerous mornings rarely announced themselves with loud noises. They become quieter, he would whisper. They're listening to themselves? Phoenix left the shelter carrying a paper cup of oatmeal Gloria had packed for his grandfather. Walter had coughed through most of the night. I'll be back before lunch, Phoenix promised. Walter nodded from his bed. Keep your eyes open. I always do. And remember. Phoenix smiled before the old man could finish. When people stop listening, Don't stop warning. Walter smiled back. The brass whistle rested comfortably inside Phoenix's pocket as he stepped into the warm morning. At Gloria's pretzel cart, business was unusually slow. Strange morning, she muttered, while arranging fresh pretzels beneath the warming lamp. Phoenix looked toward the intersection. No pigeons again. She followed his gaze. They've been gone 2 days now. He frowned. And the squirrels? Gloria blinked. What squirrels? They always climb that maple tree. She looked across the street. The branches were empty. I guess you're right. Phoenix didn't answer. Instead, he inhaled carefully. The faint smell returned. Not overwhelming, not enough for passers-by to notice, but stronger than yesterday. Natural gas, mixed with wet concrete. He instinctively touched the whistle in his pocket. Gloria noticed. You all right? I think something's wrong. She looked toward the construction site. They've been digging for months. I know. What kind of wrong? Phoenix searched for words. I don't know yet. That answer worried Gloria more than if he had claimed certainty, because Phoenix rarely guessed. He simply observed. Across the street, work began precisely at 7. Concrete saws screamed into motion. Excavators lurched forward. Backup alarms echoed between old brick buildings. Workers disappeared beneath temporary scaffolding. The project manager, Brian Keller, walked confidently from crew to crew, checking schedules instead of equipment. He carried a clipboard in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. Efficiency, momentum, deadlines. Everything seemed to matter more than caution. Phoenix wandered closer, pretending to collect discarded cans near the fence. He recognized Noah Bennett almost immediately. The young engineer looked even more exhausted than yesterday. He carried 2 pressure gauges and spoke urgently with another utility technician. Phoenix couldn't hear every word, only fragments. Pressure spike. Doesn't match yesterday? Line shouldn't be doing that. The technician shrugged. Tell Brian. I already did. And? He said keep working. The technician sighed before climbing down a temporary ladder into an underground utility access shaft. Noah remained above, staring into the opening long after the man disappeared. His jaw tightened. He looked like someone waiting for bad news he already expected. Phoenix continued along the fence. Then he stopped. A vibration traveled beneath his shoes. Not from heavy machinery. Those vibrations came and went rhythmically. This one continued. He crouched again. His fingertips touched the sidewalk. A faint trembling pulsed through the concrete. Steady, persistent, like a heartbeat. A city bus rolled past. The vibration didn't change. That shouldn't happen. Phoenix looked toward the storm drain he had examined yesterday. Tiny bubbles rose through a shallow puddle gathered beside it. 1, 2, 3, then another. He had seen bubbles before, but never where there was no flowing water. He looked closer. The puddle smelled faintly of sulfur. His stomach tightened. Someone shouted from inside the construction site. Heads turned. A worker climbed rapidly out of the underground access shaft. His orange safety vest had turned nearly gray with dust. His face had lost all color. It was the same utility technician Noah had spoken with moments earlier. The man pulled off his hard hat. Noah. His voice cracked. Phoenix couldn't hear every word, only scattered pieces carried by the wind. Pressure's climbing. We need to. Shut. Noah immediately grabbed a radio. Before either man could speak further, Brian Keller strode toward them. What now? The technician answered first. I don't like the readings. Brian rolled his eyes. You people never like readings. I'm serious. The gauge jumped again. Brian took the clipboard from Noah, glanced at it for less than 3 seconds, then handed it back. We're opening in 48 hours. Sir, the city inspectors arrived this afternoon. We should evacuate the lower section. Brian's expression hardened, based on one unstable gauge. No. Based on 3. Brian looked around. Several workers had stopped to watch. He lowered his voice. Do you want everyone here thinking the site's unsafe? The technician hesitated. Brian continued. Replace the sensor. What if it isn't the sensor? It is. And if it isn't? Brian stared at him coldly. Then prove it. He turned away. Everybody back to work. One by one, the workers obeyed. Not because they believed him, because he signed their paychecks. Phoenix watched Noah remain frozen beside the utility shaft. The engineer looked down into the darkness below, then slowly closed his eyes. For just a moment, as though silently asking himself whether to disobey. Phoenix had seen that expression before, on Walter. Whenever firefighters were ordered into buildings they knew were becoming unstable. The young engineer suddenly looked up. His eyes met Phoenix's through the chain-link fence. Neither spoke, neither smiled. Yet something passed between them. Recognition. They were strangers, separated by age, by education, by circumstance. But both had reached exactly the same conclusion. Something beneath their feet was dangerously wrong. A loud metallic crack echoed from somewhere underground. Not explosive. More like an enormous pipe shifting against concrete. Most workers ignored it. Construction sites produced noises all day. Phoenix noticed several pigeons suddenly appear overhead. Not landing, flying. Fast. They crossed above the project without slowing, heading north, away. His pulse quickened. Animals left first. Walter had taught him that after wildfires, people trusted reports. Animals trusted instinct. Phoenix stepped toward the construction gate. The security guard from yesterday spotted him immediately. You again? I need to tell someone. I told you to stay away. It's important. So is staying outside this fence. Phoenix looked past him toward Noah. Please! The guard folded his arms. Go home, kid. I don't have one. The words slipped out before Phoenix realized he'd spoken them. For the briefest moment, the guard's expression softened. Then training returned. You still can't be here. Phoenix slowly backed away, but he didn't leave. Instead, he crossed to the opposite sidewalk where he could continue watching. Somewhere beneath the pavement, another muffled thud rolled through the earth. Almost no one reacted. Almost. Noah did. He spun toward the utility shaft. Phoenix did the same. Neither of them knew that within the next 24 hours, this quiet uneasiness would become a desperate race against time, and that an 11-year-old homeless boy would soon make a decision that would place his own life directly in front of a billionaire's speeding limousine. Friday morning dawned under a cloudless sky. If someone had looked only at the weather forecast, they would have expected a perfect day for celebration. By 8:30 a.m., television vans had already parked near the South Market redevelopment site. City officials adjusted microphones while photographers searched for the best angles. Colorful banners fluttered gently above temporary stages, announcing the beginning of a new chapter for the neighborhood. No one could see the danger hidden beneath the pavement. Jonathan Mercer sat in the back of his black limousine reviewing the speech he had rewritten 3 times the night before. He disliked public appearances. Buildings made sense. Steel made sense. Budgets made sense. Crowds did not. Emily Carter glanced at her tablet. The mayor's office just confirmed arrival in 20 minutes. Jonathan nodded. Any updates from the project? Nothing unusual. She hesitated. Noah Bennett submitted another request for an underground inspection at 6:42 this morning. Jonathan looked up. And Brian Keller marked it as non-critical. Jonathan stared out the window. Did Noah include new data? only that pressure readings continue to fluctuate. He considered the information for a moment. We'll review it after the ceremony. Emily typed another note. The limousine continued toward South Market. Less than a mile away, Phoenix Price was walking much faster than usual. Walter's words from the night before echoed endlessly inside his mind. Cities breathe. Cities groan. Cities warn. The brass whistle bounced lightly against his leg with every step. As he approached Gloria's pretzel cart, she immediately recognized something was wrong. You look like you didn't sleep. I didn't. Grandpa worse? Phoenix shook his head. The street. Gloria frowned. What about it? It feels... He struggled to describe something that existed more in instinct than language. Different. She looked toward the construction site. Workers were everywhere. News reporters, police officers directing traffic. Nothing seemed unusual. You still thinking about those gas smells? They're stronger, Gloria inhaled. I still can't smell anything. Phoenix looked toward the empty rooftops. No pigeons, no sparrows, not even the usual crows perched on the traffic lights. Only silence. A city bus rolled through the intersection. The vibration beneath Phoenix's shoes felt noticeably stronger than yesterday. He looked down. The same crooked manhole cover now sat almost 2 inches above the surrounding pavement. Nobody else noticed. People stepped around it while staring at their phones. A bicycle courier rode directly over it without slowing. Phoenix hurried toward the construction fence. Noah Bennett stood near the underground access shaft, speaking urgently into a radio. His voice was sharper than before. I'm requesting immediate shutdown. He listened. His shoulders fell. Understood. He lowered the radio with visible frustration. Phoenix crossed the street. Before the security guard could stop him, he called out. Mr. Bennett! Noah turned. Recognition flashed across his face. The kid. Phoenix stopped outside the fence. Something's worse today. Noah looked around carefully. What did you notice? The smell. The ground? The birds. Noah's expression changed. You noticed the birds. Phoenix nodded. They've been gone since Tuesday. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Noah leaned closer to the fence. I've requested 3 emergency inspections. What happened? They keep saying the instruments are wrong. Are they? I don't think so. Phoenix swallowed. Then why doesn't anyone stop? Noah looked toward the ceremony stage, where workers arranged chairs. Because today costs too much to postpone. The words settled heavily between them. Brian Keller suddenly appeared. What are you doing? Noah straightened immediately. Checking the perimeter. Brian's eyes shifted toward Phoenix. You again? Phoenix didn't move. Brian pointed toward the sidewalk. I told you to stay away from this site. I think something's wrong. Brian laughed without humor. You think? Phoenix nodded. I do. Brian looked at Noah. You're taking engineering advice from children now. No? Then let's get back to work. Brian walked away, already speaking into his phone. Noah watched him disappear before quietly saying, If I tell everyone to evacuate without authorization, I'll lose my job. Phoenix answered with surprising calm. If you don't. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. At 9:12 a.m., Jonathan's limousine turned onto Market Street. Police motorcycles cleared the lane ahead. Pedestrians paused to watch the procession. Phoenix happened to glance toward the intersection at exactly the same moment. His heartbeat stopped. The limousine. It was heading directly toward the section of road where the vibration felt strongest. Then he heard it. A deep, metallic groan. Not from above, from beneath. It lasted barely 2 seconds. Phoenix's eyes dropped to the pavement. Tiny cracks spread across the edge of the raised manhole cover. almost invisible. Then they stopped. A construction worker climbed out of the utility shaft at full speed. It was the same technician from yesterday. His face was covered with gray dust. He shouted something toward Noah. Phoenix couldn't hear every word. Only one. "Run!" Noah spun around instantly. His radio slipped from his hand. At that exact moment, Brian grabbed his arm. "No!" Noah pulled free. "We have to clear the street," Brian shouted back. "We don't have confirmation. We don't have time." The limousine continued rolling forward. Jonathan looked down at his notes, completely unaware. Phoenix didn't think. He ran. People yelled as the barefoot boy darted between moving cars. A taxi slammed its brakes. Someone blew a horn. A cyclist cursed. Phoenix ignored all of it. He sprinted straight toward the black limousine. The lead security vehicle accelerated. One bodyguard stepped forward, believing the child intended to attack the motorcade. Phoenix reached the driver's side just as Jonathan opened the rear door. "Don't get in that car!" His voice tore through the intersection. Everyone froze. The bodyguard grabbed Phoenix by the shoulders. "What are you doing?" Phoenix struggled desperately. "Please!" Jonathan frowned. "What is this?" The boy looked directly into his eyes, not asking for money, not begging, not crying, only terrified. "Please don't drive there." Jonathan's patience disappeared. "Move him aside." The bodyguard began pulling Phoenix away. "I'm sorry, sir." Phoenix twisted free just enough to point toward the pavement. "It's underneath." Jonathan looked down instinctively. "There." For one brief second, nothing happened. The crowd began relaxing. Several reporters laughed nervously. Brian Keller folded his arms with obvious irritation. Then Noah screamed. "Everybody back!" His voice carried across the entire block. Less than 3 seconds later, the first emergency siren wailed from somewhere beyond the intersection. A police cruiser came racing around the corner. Behind it came 2 fire engines, then a gas utility truck. An officer jumped from his vehicle before it had fully stopped. "Seal the street. Nobody moves. Gas leak. Clear the area now." Within moments, officers pushed civilians backward, while firefighters unrolled emergency tape across every entrance to the block. The celebration stage was abandoned. Microphones toppled onto the pavement. Television cameras kept recording. Jonathan slowly turned toward Phoenix. The frightened boy stood clutching the old brass whistle in one trembling hand. For the first time in years, the billionaire looked at someone society barely noticed and realized that child had seen danger long before everyone, with titles, uniforms, expensive degrees, and authority. For nearly 20 seconds after the emergency crews arrived, no one moved. The reporters who had been adjusting microphones now pointed their cameras toward the flashing lights instead of the ceremonial stage. Construction workers stood frozen behind the barricades. City officials looked at one another, waiting for someone else to explain what had just happened. Jonathan Mercer remained beside the open limousine door. His speech had slipped from his hand onto the pavement. He barely noticed. His eyes never left the barefoot boy standing several feet away. Phoenix's breathing was still uneven from sprinting across traffic. His faded gray t-shirt clung to his shoulders with sweat, and the old brass whistle trembled slightly in his fingers. The bodyguard released his grip. "I'm sorry, sir," he said quietly to Jonathan. "I thought he was trying to get to you." Jonathan didn't answer. Instead, he watched firefighters rush toward the construction zone carrying gas detectors. Within moments, one of the handheld monitors emitted a rapid, high-pitched alarm. Another firefighter raised his arm. "We've got elevated readings," a police lieutenant immediately shouted toward the crowd. "Expand the perimeter." Everyone back another 50 yards. Orange barricades appeared almost instantly. Workers abandoned equipment where it stood. Television anchors who had expected to cover a ribbon-cutting ceremony suddenly found themselves reporting a developing emergency. Jonathan finally spoke. "What exactly is happening?" A fire captain approached him. "We've detected a significant gas leak underground, sir." "How significant?" "We don't know yet." "Is there danger?" The captain looked toward the cracked pavement. "We're treating it as if there is." Jonathan nodded once. No further questions. Years in business had taught him something valuable. When experienced professionals stopped pretending to know everything, the situation was usually serious. His attention shifted back to Phoenix. The boy had quietly stepped away from the growing crowd. Not toward television cameras, not toward reporters. Away, as though his part in the morning was already finished. Jonathan frowned. "Wait." Phoenix stopped walking. The billionaire crossed the sidewalk until they stood face to face. For the first time, Jonathan noticed details that hadn't registered earlier. The boy's sneakers were held together with mismatched shoelaces. One sleeve had been stitched by hand. His backpack had been repaired so many times that almost every zipper was a different color. Nothing about him suggested someone seeking attention. "What made you stop me?" Jonathan asked calmly. Phoenix looked toward the construction site. "I heard it." "Heard what?" "The ground." Jonathan waited. "And before that," Phoenix searched for words. "The city." Jonathan stared at him. "I'm not sure I understand." Phoenix lowered his eyes. "I don't really understand either." That answer felt strangely honest. Emily Carter stepped beside Jonathan. "The mayor's office wants you moved to a secure location." "In a minute." She glanced at Phoenix. "Sir, reporters are coming." Indeed, several cameras had already begun turning toward them. Jonathan disliked media attention under normal circumstances. He disliked it even more when children became part of the story. He looked back at Phoenix. "What's your name?" "Phoenix." "Last name?" "Price." "Where do you live?" Phoenix hesitated. Jonathan immediately regretted the question. The boy answered anyway. "At St. Matthew's Shelter." Emily quietly wrote the information into her tablet. Jonathan noticed. "No." She looked up. "No publicity." "Understood." "I don't want cameras following him." Emily nodded. "Of course." Across the street, Brian Keller approached, wearing an expression carefully balanced between concern and irritation. "Jonathan." "What happened?" Brian spread his hands. "It appears one of the utility sensors malfunctioned." Noah Bennett, standing several yards behind him, looked up immediately. Jonathan noticed. "So this wasn't anticipated?" Brian answered without hesitation. "No." Noah took one step forward. "It was?" Silence. Brian turned sharply. "Noah." The young engineer swallowed. "I submitted 3 inspection requests." Brian's jaw tightened. "We already discussed this." "I documented abnormal pressure." "Which wasn't confirmed." "It wasn't investigated." Several nearby firefighters stopped talking. Emily slowly lowered her tablet. Jonathan looked from one man to the other. "When?" Noah answered. "Yesterday." "And again this morning," Brian interrupted. "We didn't have evidence requiring shutdown." Noah's voice remained steady. "We had enough evidence to investigate." Jonathan said nothing. Not because he had chosen a side, because he had suddenly remembered Emily mentioning Noah's requests during the limousine ride. He had postponed the conversation, review it after the ceremony. The sentence echoed unpleasantly inside his head. A loud, cracking sound interrupted everyone's thoughts. This time it came from the street itself. Several people instinctively stepped backward. A jagged crack no wider than a finger appeared near the raised manhole cover Phoenix had noticed hours earlier. Dust drifted upward. The fire captain didn't hesitate. "Everyone farther back." The remaining workers retreated immediately. Brian's confidence visibly faded. Jonathan watched the growing crack in complete silence. Then he looked at Phoenix again. "You saw this coming?" Phoenix shook his head. "I knew something was wrong." "How?" "I don't know." Jonathan studied the boy's face. There was no pride there, no excitement, only worry. "For everybody." Reporters finally reached them. "Mr. Mercer, did the child save your life? Did someone warn your company?" "Who is this boy?" Jonathan stepped between the cameras and Phoenix. "No interviews." "But sir." "No." The firmness in his voice ended further questions. Phoenix used the distraction to quietly slip away. By the time Jonathan turned around again, the boy was gone. He disappeared into the crowd with the same quietness that had defined every part of his life. Invisible once more. Emily scanned both sidewalks. "I've lost sight of him." Jonathan continued searching. "Find him. We only have his first and last name." "And the shelter?" Emily nodded. "I'll start there." Meanwhile, several blocks away, Phoenix hurried toward St. Matthew's shelter, carrying the bag of medicine he had picked up from the free clinic before everything happened. His thoughts weren't on billionaires, or television cameras, or reporters. Only one thought repeated inside his mind. Grandpa. Walter would need his afternoon medication before noon. Phoenix climbed the shelter steps 2 at a time. Inside, Walter was sitting near the window exactly where Phoenix had left him. The old man looked up with a smile. "You're early." Phoenix knelt beside him. "You won't believe what happened." Walter noticed the trembling hands before hearing the story. "What is it?" Phoenix slowly placed the brass whistle on the table. Then he whispered, "I think." People finally listened. Walter looked into his grandson's eyes for a long moment. Then he smiled with quiet relief. "Good." Outside, television helicopters circled above South Market, while emergency crews continued sealing the neighborhood. Inside Mercer Urban Development Headquarters, Emily Carter had already begun searching every available record for one name: Phoenix Price. Jonathan Mercer wasn't interested in rewarding a boy with money. Not yet. He first wanted to answer a question that refused to leave his mind. How could an 11-year-old homeless child recognize a disaster that engineers, executives, inspectors, and one of the largest development companies in the country had all failed to see? By late afternoon, every major television station in Philadelphia had replayed the same footage dozens of times. A barefoot homeless boy running into traffic, a billionaire stopping beside his limousine, police cars racing into the intersection, firefighters sealing an entire city block. Commentators called it extraordinary timing. Some called it luck. Others called it intuition. Only Jonathan Mercer refused to call it either. He had spent his entire career believing that every outcome had a reason, whether people understood it or not. Children did not predict disasters. They observed something adults ignored. He intended to find out what that was. At Mercer Urban Development Headquarters, the atmosphere felt nothing like a normal Friday afternoon. Conference rooms that usually hosted investors were now filled with engineers, legal advisors, safety consultants, and city officials. No one mentioned the canceled ceremony anymore. Everyone wanted answers. Jonathan entered the executive conference room without speaking. Emily Carter was already waiting beside a large display screen. "I've gathered everything we have." Jonathan took his seat. "Start with the engineering reports." Emily tapped the screen. A timeline appeared. Monday, routine pressure inspection, normal. Tuesday, minor fluctuation, marked acceptable. Wednesday, additional pressure variation, no follow-up ordered. Thursday, Noah Bennett submitted an inspection request. Status deferred. Friday, second inspection request. Status deferred. Friday morning. Third inspection request. Status closed. Jonathan looked up slowly. Closed. Emily nodded. It was marked resolved at 7:03 this morning. By whom? She pressed another key. Brian Keller's authorization appeared on the screen. Jonathan remained silent. The room suddenly felt much colder. Where's Brian? He's meeting with city investigators. After that. I want him here. Emily nodded. There's something else. She opened another file. These are public complaints submitted over the last 4 months. Jonathan frowned. I wasn't aware there were complaints. There were 38. She scrolled. Residents reported strange vibrations, gas odors, cracks in sidewalks, shifting manhole covers, basement walls developing new fractures. Jonathan leaned forward. When were these submitted? Over several months. And who reviewed them? Emily hesitated. The project office. Meaning Brian Keller. Jonathan's expression hardened. Were they investigated? Most were marked. She looked at the screen again. Low priority. Jonathan closed the file without another word. Across town, Phoenix sat beside Walter's bed while the old man finished his medication. The shelter television happened to be showing the news. Neither of them paid much attention until the reporter displayed an aerial view of South Market. Authorities continue investigating today's emergency. The homeless child involved has not yet been identified publicly. Walter quietly lowered the television volume. You didn't tell anyone your full story. Phoenix shook his head. They didn't ask. They would have. I wanted to come home. Walter smiled. Good. Phoenix looked confused. You think I should have stayed? Walter slowly shook his head. When you help someone, your first reward should be knowing you did the right thing. Not waiting for applause. Phoenix looked at the brass whistle lying beside his backpack. I wasn't trying to save a billionaire. I know. I was trying to stop the car. Walter laughed softly. Exactly. Meanwhile, several miles away, Emily had decided to investigate something Jonathan hadn't requested. The boy. She drove to St. Matthew Shelter, carrying nothing more than a notebook and genuine curiosity. The shelter director greeted her politely. Can I help you? I'm looking for Phoenix Price. The director smiled immediately. Phoenix hasn't done anything wrong, has he? Emily blinked. No. The director seemed relieved. I figured. He usually helps everyone before they even ask. Emily glanced around the modest building. How long has he been here? Almost 14 months. And his grandfather. Walter's been with us a little longer. Emily made another note. They're good people. The director continued before Emily asked another question. Phoenix wakes before anyone. He cleans without being told. If another child skips breakfast, he pretends he isn't hungry. Emily stopped writing. Really? The director nodded. You'd never know how little they have. Walter never lets the boy feel sorry for himself. She smiled. Actually, I think it's the other way around now. Emily thanked her before leaving. Outside, she noticed Gloria Jenkins closing her pretzel cart nearby. On impulse, Emily walked over. Excuse me. Gloria looked up. Can I help you? I'm looking for information about Phoenix Price. Gloria's expression immediately softened. Sweet kid. You know him? I've known him over a year. Emily smiled politely. Can I ask you something? Sure. Has he ever talked about construction problems? Gloria laughed quietly. He notices everything. What do you mean, if a streetlight burns out? Phoenix notices. If a water pipe starts leaking, Phoenix notices. If somebody leaves a dog tied outside too long, Phoenix notices. Emily folded her arms. And this week, Gloria became serious. He kept saying the street felt wrong. You believed him? I believed that he believed it. She paused. That's different. Emily nodded thoughtfully. Back at Mercer headquarters, Jonathan entered the digital records department himself. Normally, he delegated work like this. Not today. I want every complaint connected to South Market. The records manager looked nervous. Every complaint. Every one. Even citizen hotline reports. Jonathan stopped walking. There were hotline reports. Yes, sir. The employee opened another database. Dozens of entries appeared. Anonymous callers, nearby residents, delivery drivers. One report after another. Most had been closed within minutes. Then Jonathan noticed something unusual. 3 separate reports had come from the same public payphone near St. Matthew Shelter. The caller identification simply listed minor. No registered name. He opened the transcript. The voice had been summarized rather than recorded. Caller reports unusual gas smell near South Market. Caller reports vibration beneath sidewalk. Caller requests someone inspect construction area. No immediate action required. Jonathan opened another. Caller insists ground movement becoming stronger. Advise caller to avoid area. Case closed. Then another. Caller believes utility line unsafe. No evidence provided. Case closed. Jonathan slowly looked toward Emily. Who made these calls? She already knew. I think... Phoenix. The room fell silent. Jonathan stared at the reports. 3 warnings, ignored. Then another thought struck him. If these were dismissed, how many other warnings have we ignored? No one answered, because suddenly the investigation had become much larger than one construction site, much larger than one canceled ceremony, much larger than one billionaire. For the first time, Jonathan Mercer began to suspect that the greatest danger beneath South Market wasn't only the damaged gas line. It was an entire system that had quietly learned to stop listening whenever the warning came from the wrong person. Saturday morning arrived without television cameras. The emergency vehicles had disappeared overnight, but the block remained surrounded by steel barricades and yellow tape. Armed police officers stood at every entrance, while engineers wearing white protective helmets moved slowly between scanning equipment and open utility shafts. For the first time in months, the neighborhood was quiet. Businesses along the street had been forced to close. Residents watched from apartment windows. Children who usually played basketball on the corner now stood behind the barricades, asking questions their parents couldn't answer. Jonathan Mercer parked his own SUV nearly 2 blocks away. No chauffeur, no security convoy. Only Emily Carter accompanied him. She noticed immediately. You didn't bring the usual team. Jonathan locked the vehicle himself. I don't think Phoenix needs to meet bodyguards. Emily smiled faintly. He probably doesn't. They walked the remaining distance in silence. Instead of entering the command center, where city officials waited for him, Jonathan crossed the street toward Gloria Jenkins' pretzel cart. Business had almost disappeared since the closure. Gloria looked up from wiping the counter. Morning. Jonathan nodded politely. Mrs. Jenkins. That's me. I'm Jonathan Mercer. I know who you are. There wasn't admiration in her voice, only recognition. Jonathan appreciated the difference. I was hoping to ask you about Phoenix. Gloria rested both hands on the cart. What about him? I'd like to thank him. She studied Jonathan for several seconds before answering. Thank him. Or reward him. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said, I don't know yet. Gloria smiled. That's the most honest thing I've heard from a rich man in years. Jonathan almost laughed. She pointed toward a nearby church. He's usually there on Saturdays, helping unload food donations. He doesn't get paid. He says carrying boxes is easier than watching old people carry them. Jonathan thanked her before walking away. As they approached the church parking lot, Emily noticed a familiar figure balancing 3 heavy produce boxes at once. Phoenix. He wasn't looking toward the street. He didn't know Jonathan was there. An elderly volunteer tried to lift another box from the delivery truck. Before she could, Phoenix hurried over. "I've got it, Miss Evelyn." "It's too heavy. I'll make 2 trips. You'll wear yourself out." He smiled. "I recover faster." The woman laughed. Jonathan quietly watched the exchange. No cameras, no audience, no performance, only habit. When the truck had finally been unloaded, Phoenix wiped sweat from his forehead and turned around. Only then did he notice Jonathan standing near the church steps. For a brief moment, surprise crossed his face, then caution. He walked over slowly. "Hello?" Jonathan extended his hand. "I'm glad I found you." Phoenix looked at the hand before shaking it politely. "Hi. I wanted to thank you." "You already did." Jonathan looked confused. "You listened." The simple answer caught him off guard. Emily quietly stepped back, allowing the conversation to become more personal. Jonathan glanced toward the empty church courtyard. "Would you mind talking for a few minutes?" Phoenix nodded. They sat on a wooden bench beneath an old oak tree. The brass whistle rested against Phoenix's chest, hanging now from a faded cord Walter had tied years ago. Jonathan noticed it immediately. "You've had that with you every time I've seen you." Phoenix touched it gently. "It belonged to my grandpa." "Was he a firefighter?" "He still is." Jonathan looked puzzled. "I thought he retired." "He says once you're a firefighter, you just stop getting paid." Jonathan smiled. "I like that." For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Jonathan reached into his jacket. Emily noticed the movement immediately. She knew exactly what was inside. A thick, white envelope. Jonathan held it for a second, then looked at Phoenix. Something about the boy's expression made him hesitate. Instead of offering the envelope, he placed it back inside his jacket. Phoenix noticed. "So," Jonathan asked quietly, "what do you need?" Phoenix blinked. "What do you mean? Done?" "If there were one thing I could do for you." The boy thought for a surprisingly long time. Jonathan expected answers involving money, housing, clothes, school supplies. Instead, Phoenix looked toward the barricaded neighborhood. "Fix the street." Jonathan followed his gaze. "So nobody gets hurt." Jonathan nodded slowly. "We're already doing that." Phoenix continued, "And," he hesitated, "my grandpa's medicine is getting expensive." Jonathan waited. Phoenix quickly added, "But we'll figure it out." "We always do." Jonathan heard something inside that sentence. Not desperation, responsibility, the kind usually carried by adults. "What about you?" Jonathan asked. "What about me?" "What do you want?" Phoenix smiled awkwardly. "I haven't really thought about that." "Why not?" "I've been busy." Jonathan looked at the 11-year-old sitting beside him. Busy surviving. Busy taking care of Walter. Busy watching streets everyone else ignored. Busy becoming responsible years before childhood should have ended. Jonathan quietly removed the white envelope again. This time he held it out. "I brought this." Phoenix looked down. He didn't touch it. "What's inside?" "A thank you." Phoenix slowly shook his head. "I can't." Jonathan frowned. "Why?" "I didn't save you for money." "I know." "If I'd take that..." He looked towards the whistle. "Grandpa will know?" Jonathan couldn't help smiling. "Will he be angry?" "No, he'd just be disappointed." "Why?" "Because he'd say helping people isn't a business." Jonathan slowly lowered the envelope. For the first time in years, someone had refused him without resentment, without pride, simply because accepting it would betray a lesson. Emily watched silently. She had spent more than a decade working beside executives. She had seen million-dollar negotiations completed in less time than this conversation. Yet this quiet exchange somehow carried more weight. Jonathan folded the envelope. "What if I help your grandfather?" Phoenix looked up immediately. "How?" "Medical care. No bills. No publicity. No cameras." Phoenix remained silent. Jonathan added gently, "I'm not paying you. I'm helping a retired firefighter." The boy thought carefully. A long pause followed. Finally, he nodded once. "I think..." He'd say yes. Jonathan smiled. "I was hoping you would." Before either could say more, Emily's phone vibrated. She answered, listened, then looked toward Jonathan. "You need to hear this." She switched the call to speaker. Noah Bennett's voice came through tense but controlled. "They've completed the first underground survey." Jonathan stood. "What did they find?" "It wasn't one damaged gas line." Silence. "There are multiple sections of unsupported ground beneath the redevelopment zone." Jonathan's expression changed. "How bad?" Another pause. "If traffic had continued through the intersection yesterday..." Noah took a slow breath. "The road very likely would have collapsed." Jonathan slowly turned toward Phoenix. The boy didn't look surprised. He looked relieved, because the feeling that had haunted him for days finally had a name. Jonathan stared at the child who had refused an envelope full of money only moments earlier. At that instant, he understood something profoundly unsettling. Phoenix hadn't prevented an inconvenience. He hadn't merely delayed a ceremony. He had almost certainly saved dozens of lives. And somehow, the person least interested in being called a hero was the one who had earned that title the most. Monday morning began with a decision that would cost Jonathan Mercer far more than money. At 8:00 a.m., the boardroom on the 32nd floor of Mercer Urban Development filled faster than anyone could remember. Outside the glass walls, Philadelphia looked peaceful beneath clear blue skies. Inside, the atmosphere carried the weight of something much heavier. Jonathan entered carrying a plain brown folder instead of his usual leather briefcase. Emily Carter noticed immediately. Whenever Jonathan carried paper instead of digital files, he intended to make a decision no one could quietly erase. Every board member had already received the preliminary engineering report before the meeting. No one looked comfortable. Jonathan remained standing. "I'm canceling the South Market project indefinitely." The room erupted almost instantly. "What?" "We've already invested." "Jonathan, that's impossible. The city's waiting." One director leaned forward. "We've already contained the gas leak." Jonathan calmly opened the folder. "It wasn't one gas leak." He placed several engineering photographs on the table. Ground-penetrating radar images, cross-sections of fractured soil, utility maps covered in red markings. The investigation identified multiple underground voids extending beneath nearly 3 blocks. Silence slowly replaced argument. Jonathan continued. If traffic had continued Friday morning, he looked around the room. The probability of roadway collapse was significant. One director rubbed his forehead. "But nobody died." Jonathan looked directly at him. "Because someone stopped my car." No one replied. Emily projected another document onto the large screen. A chronological list of ignored warnings appeared. Citizen complaints, engineering requests, emergency hotline calls, inspection delays. Every line ended with the same digital authorization. Brian Keller, the company's chief legal officer, finally spoke. "Before we continue, has Mr. Keller responded?" Jonathan nodded once. "He's waiting outside." Emily opened the conference room door. Brian Keller entered wearing the same expensive gray suit he always wore to executive meetings. Only his confidence had disappeared. He looked around the room before taking a seat. Jonathan remained standing. I have one question. Brian nodded. I'll answer anything. Jonathan slid the printed hotline reports across the table. Did you know residents were reporting vibrations for months? Brian glanced down. Some reports came in. 38. Brian swallowed. Many turned out to be unrelated. Jonathan didn't raise his voice. What about Noah Bennett's inspection requests? Brian adjusted his tie. We had no conclusive evidence. Jonathan picked up another document. You marked them resolved. They were under review. They were marked closed. Brian hesitated. The project couldn't stop every time someone became nervous. Jonathan stared at him. Someone. Brian shifted uncomfortably. The engineer. The residents. The anonymous callers. Jonathan stepped closer. The anonymous caller was an 11-year-old homeless boy. Brian blinked. I didn't know that. No. You never asked. Silence settled across the boardroom. Jonathan continued. Did you investigate his reports? Brian looked down. He wasn't qualified. Jonathan's voice became quieter. Neither is the grandmother who smells gas. Neither is the delivery driver who notices new cracks. Neither is the child who sees birds disappear. He paused. But they live there. They notice things. Brian finally defended himself. I followed procedure. Jonathan answered immediately. No. You followed schedule. The distinction landed heavily. No one around the table argued. Jonathan pressed a button on the conference room remote. A video appeared on the screen. Noah Bennett. Recorded only an hour earlier. I repeatedly requested emergency inspections. I was instructed to continue operations. I believed the project should have been temporarily suspended. I documented my concerns. The video ended. Jonathan looked at Brian. Did Noah ever tell you the readings were stable? Brian remained silent. Answer. No. Did he recommend continuing work? No. Did you report that accurately to me? Another pause. No. Jonathan closed the folder. Then we're done. Brian stared upward. Jonathan. You know this will destroy my career. Jonathan's expression never changed. It almost destroyed an entire neighborhood. Security officers quietly entered the room. No shouting followed. No dramatic confrontation. Brian simply stood. For the first time since joining Mercer Urban Development 12 years earlier, he looked like an ordinary man instead of an executive. As he reached the doorway, he stopped. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Jonathan finally answered with visible sadness. I believe you. That's what makes this worse. Brian lowered his head before walking away. The door closed softly behind him. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, one board member broke the silence. What happens now? Jonathan looked around the room. Now? We start acting like the company we claim to be. That afternoon, he walked into the temporary engineering office built beside the closed construction site. Noah Bennett looked surprised to see him. I wasn't expecting you. Jonathan extended his hand. I owe you an apology. Noah blinked. For what? You warned us. I didn't listen. Noah accepted the handshake. I should have pushed harder. Jonathan shook his head. You shouldn't have had to. He looked around the office. Blueprints covered every wall. So did updated geological surveys. What do you need? Noah seemed confused. For the investigation? Noah answered immediately. Time. And independence. No pressure from deadlines. Jonathan nodded. You have both. Later that evening, Jonathan asked Emily to drive him somewhere without informing anyone. St. Matthew Shelter. The shelter director welcomed them quietly. Walter Price sat reading beside the window, while Phoenix sorted donated books into cardboard boxes. Neither expected visitors. Phoenix looked up first. "Mr. Mercer." Jonathan smiled. "I hope we're not interrupting." Walter slowly stood despite obvious discomfort. "You must be Jonathan." "I am." Walter extended a weathered hand. Jonathan shook it respectfully. "I've wanted to meet the firefighter." Walter chuckled. "I've wanted to meet the businessman." They sat together around a small folding table. For several minutes they talked about ordinary things. Weather, Philadelphia, baseball. Only after the conversation settled naturally did Jonathan speak again. "I dismissed warnings I should have investigated." Walter listened quietly. "I trusted paperwork more than people." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "A lot of good people do." Jonathan looked at him. "How do you avoid making that mistake?" Walter smiled toward Phoenix. "I don't. I just try to remember." He pointed gently toward his grandson. "That sometimes the smallest voice carries the biggest truth." Jonathan followed his gaze. Phoenix was helping another child choose a book from the donation box. He wasn't talking about the news. He wasn't talking about saving anyone. He was explaining why adventure stories were more fun than superhero comics. Jonathan watched the scene in silence. For the first time since building his company decades earlier, he understood that leadership wasn't measured by how many people followed your instructions. It was measured by how quickly you stopped and listened when the quietest person in the room said something didn't feel right. Outside the shelter, the repaired brass whistle hanging around Phoenix's neck caught the last rays of the setting sun. Jonathan found himself looking at it for a long time. He no longer saw an old piece of metal. He saw something much more valuable, a reminder that warnings only save lives when someone chooses to hear them. 3 days later, the story everyone thought they understood changed completely. Until then, newspapers had celebrated a simple headline: "Homeless boy saves billionaire." It was dramatic. It attracted clicks. It fit neatly into a single sentence. Jonathan Mercer hated it. Every time he saw the headline, he felt it erased the most important truth. Phoenix hadn't saved a billionaire. He had tried to save everyone. On Wednesday morning, Jonathan walked into the company's auditorium, where more than 600 employees had gathered for an emergency all-hands meeting. People whispered nervously. Some expected layoffs. Others expected another carefully polished corporate statement. Instead, Jonathan stood alone on the stage. No giant presentation. No marketing slogans. Only a small wooden podium. Emily Carter watched quietly from the front row. She had worked beside Jonathan for 11 years. She had never seen him this unsettled. Jonathan adjusted the microphone. "I've given hundreds of speeches." He paused. "This may be the first honest one." The room fell silent. "Our company nearly failed the people it exists to serve." No one moved. "We missed warnings. We ignored voices. And I accepted reports without asking who had been left out of them." Several department managers lowered their heads. Jonathan continued. "The greatest mistake wasn't an engineering failure. It was believing information only mattered if it came from someone with the right title." A large photograph appeared on the screen behind him. Not of the construction site, not of the damaged road. It showed an old brass firefighter's whistle resting in the palm of a child's hand. Employees looked at one another. Jonathan spoke softly. "Most of you know the boy who stopped my car. What you don't know is that he reported danger several times before that morning." Another image appeared. Copies of the hotline reports. 3 ignored calls, 3 dismissed warnings, 3 opportunities. Jonathan looked around the auditorium. Nobody asked his age. Nobody asked his name. Nobody asked why he believed people were in danger. They simply decided he wasn't qualified to be heard. The words hung heavily in the room. Near the back, several customer service representatives exchanged uneasy glances. One quietly whispered, "We've done that." Jonathan heard him. So have I. No defensiveness, no excuses, only truth. We cannot become a company that only listens upward. The meeting ended without applause. Employees left quietly. Many walked directly back to their offices. Some opened files they hadn't looked at in months. Others began reviewing complaint systems that had long been treated as routine paperwork. For the first time in years, people weren't asking how quickly projects could move. They were asking what they might have missed. Across town, Phoenix had no idea any of this was happening. His morning looked almost exactly like every other one. He swept the shelter hallway before breakfast. He helped Mrs. Alvarez carry laundry downstairs. He fixed the loose wheel on an elderly resident's walker using an old screwdriver Walter kept in his toolbox. Afterward, he and Walter sat outside on a weathered wooden bench, sharing one pretzel Gloria had secretly made twice the normal size. Walter tore it exactly in half. "You know, I've been thinking," Phoenix smiled. "That usually means a lecture." Walter laughed until coughing interrupted him. When he finally caught his breath, he looked at his grandson. "When I was your age, I thought courage meant running into burning buildings." Phoenix listened quietly. "Then I became a firefighter. And I learned courage usually starts much earlier." "How?" Walter pointed gently toward Phoenix's chest where the whistle rested. "It starts the moment someone decides to speak." Phoenix looked down. "I was scared." "I know. I almost didn't run." Walter nodded. "That's courage." "If you weren't afraid." "It would have just been instinct." A familiar black SUV slowly pulled into the shelter parking lot. Jonathan Mercer stepped out carrying no briefcase, no envelope, only 2 paper coffee cups. Emily followed behind, holding a plain cardboard box. Phoenix stood. "You came back?" Jonathan smiled. "I said I would." Walter noticed the coffee. "You guessed right." Jonathan laughed. "Emily called the shelter director." Walter accepted the cup. "That's not cheating." The 4 of them sat together beneath the shade of an old maple tree. For nearly 20 minutes, no one discussed the accident. Instead, they talked about baseball. Walter argued the Phillies still needed better pitching. Jonathan admitted he hadn't attended a game in years. Phoenix couldn't believe anyone would choose not to. Even Emily laughed. The conversation felt surprisingly ordinary. That Jonathan realized was exactly what made it meaningful. Eventually, Emily opened the cardboard box. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters. Phoenix looked confused. "What are those?" "They're from our employees," Jonathan answered. "They heard your story." "I didn't tell anyone." "I know." "They wrote anyway." Phoenix carefully picked up the first envelope. A maintenance supervisor thanked him for reminding him to listen to residents instead of schedules. A receptionist admitted she often rushed callers without really hearing them. A young engineer wrote that Noah Bennett had inspired him to speak up more often. Phoenix looked overwhelmed. "I can't keep these." Jonathan shook his head. "They aren't gifts. They're promises." Walter quietly wiped one eye. He pretended dust had blown into it. Jonathan noticed, but said nothing. After a long silence, Phoenix asked a question no one expected. "Did people lose their jobs?" Jonathan answered honestly. "One man did." Phoenix looked troubled. "I didn't want that." "I know. He has a family too." Jonathan studied the boy carefully. Most adults would have felt vindicated. Phoenix looked saddened. Jonathan nodded. "I've been thinking about that too." "What will happen to him?" "He'll answer for his decisions." "But I hope—" Jonathan paused. "He also gets the chance to become a better man." Walter smiled faintly. "Now you're starting to sound like a firefighter." Jonathan looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "We believe in rescue first. Even when someone made the fire, The words settled quietly over the group. As the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the shelter yard, Jonathan watched Phoenix helping another child tie a broken shoelace. No one had asked him. He simply noticed. The same way he had noticed the missing birds. The same way he had noticed the trembling sidewalk. The same way he noticed lonely people before anyone else did. Jonathan finally understood something that every report, every engineering diagram, and every investigation had failed to explain. Phoenix's greatest gift wasn't extraordinary hearing or impossible intuition. It was attention. In a world rushing past one another every day, an 11-year-old homeless boy had developed the rare habit of truly seeing, and Jonathan began to wonder how different his company, and perhaps even his own life, might have been if he had learned that lesson years earlier. Autumn arrived quietly in Philadelphia. The maple trees surrounding St. Matthew's shelter had begun turning shades of amber and crimson, and the morning air carried just enough chill for people to pull light jackets from their closets. 3 months had passed since the street had been sealed. The construction fences were still there, but they surrounded engineers instead of investors. Every section of damaged ground was being rebuilt from the foundation upward. This time, nobody was rushing. Jonathan Mercer had personally signed an order that appeared on every active Mercer urban development project across the country. No construction deadline would ever take priority over a credible safety concern again. Some shareholders called the policy expensive. Jonathan called it overdue. One Tuesday morning, Emily Carter arrived at headquarters carrying a thick, blue binder. She placed it on Jonathan's desk. "The proposal is ready." Jonathan closed the file he had been reading. "What do you think?" Emily smiled. "I think one 11-year-old just changed how this company listens." Jonathan opened the binder. Across the cover, printed in simple, dark blue letters, were 4 words: Street Watch Voices. There were no corporate slogans beneath the title, no marketing language, only one sentence: "Every voice deserves to be heard before danger becomes visible." Jonathan read it twice, then nodded. "Let's do it." The program looked remarkably simple. Residents would be able to report safety concerns directly through neighborhood centers, libraries, shelters, schools, churches, and community organizations, instead of navigating complicated government websites or corporate hotlines. Every report would receive a tracking number. Every report would require a documented response. No complaint could be closed without physical verification. Most importantly, no report would be ranked according to who submitted it. An engineer, a janitor, a school student, a delivery driver, a homeless veteran. Every observation would enter the same review system. Emily looked across the table. "There's one more idea." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "We should invite community advisors." "You mean city officials?" She smiled. "No. I mean people who actually walk these neighborhoods every day." Jonathan immediately understood. "Phoenix." Emily nodded. "And people like him." Later that week, Jonathan drove to St. Matthew's shelter again. Walter's health had declined noticeably. The coughing came more frequently now, forcing longer pauses during conversations. Yet his eyes remained bright. Phoenix opened the shelter door before Jonathan even knocked. "Mr. Mercer." Jonathan laughed. "How did you know it was me?" "You always park in the visitor space." Jonathan looked toward the parking lot. "I suppose I do." Walter chuckled from inside. "Told you he notices everything." They sat around the same folding table they had shared several times over the past months. Jonathan removed a folder. "I need your help." Phoenix looked surprised. "My help." Jonathan slid several pages across the table. "We're starting a new program." Phoenix slowly read the first page. Street Watch Voices. "What is it?" Jonathan answered carefully. "It's a promise." He explained how residents could report hazards directly, how every concern would be investigated, how community observations would become part of engineering decisions instead of being ignored. Phoenix listened without interrupting. When Jonathan finished, he asked, "What do you think?" Phoenix looked at the papers for another moment, then asked a question Jonathan hadn't expected. "Will people believe children?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He wanted the answer to be true, not merely hopeful. "They'll have to." "Why?" "Because we're going to build the system so they can't ignore them." Phoenix looked toward Walter. The old firefighter smiled proudly. "That's how you fix more than roads." Jonathan nodded. "Exactly." He turned back to Phoenix. "I'd like you to be our first community safety advisor." Phoenix blinked. "I don't know anything about construction?" "No," Jonathan smiled. "But you know how to notice." Walter laughed softly. "Hardest skill to teach." Phoenix looked uncertain. "What would I have to do?" "Walk. Observe. Ask questions. And remind our engineers what neighborhoods actually feel like." The boy thought quietly. "I still have school." Jonathan smiled. "Good. You should. This isn't a job. It's a conversation." Phoenix finally nodded. "I'll try." Walter placed a hand gently on his grandson's shoulder. "Trying honestly beats pretending perfectly." Over the next several weeks, street watch voices slowly spread across Philadelphia. Suggestion boxes appeared inside community centers. Elementary schools received colorful posters encouraging children to report unsafe sidewalks, broken streetlights, and unusual smells. Public libraries hosted neighborhood listening sessions. Churches distributed information after Sunday services. The city's first meeting took place in a recreation center only 6 blocks from South Market. Jonathan deliberately sat in the audience instead of on stage. Engineers shared folding chairs with senior citizens. Teenagers sat beside architects. Bus drivers spoke after professors. Nobody received reserved seating. Phoenix quietly watched everything from the second row. When the moderator invited comments, an elderly woman stood first. "I've been reporting flooding near my apartment for 4 years." A city engineer immediately wrote down the address. "No one ever asked me where exactly." She looked genuinely surprised. Another resident raised his hand. "The sidewalk near Lincoln Elementary sinks every winter." A Mercer project manager responded, "We'll inspect it tomorrow." Phoenix noticed something. The manager didn't ask who owned the property. He didn't ask whether the speaker had engineering credentials. He simply listened. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours. As everyone packed up, Noah Bennett walked over carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate, one for himself, one for Phoenix. "I thought you might be cold." Phoenix accepted it gratefully. "Thanks," Noah smiled. "You know, I almost quit." Phoenix looked up. "Really? I figured nobody wanted engineers who kept slowing projects down." "What changed?" Noah glanced across the room where Jonathan was speaking with neighborhood residents. "You," Phoenix frowned. "I didn't do anything. You reminded me why I became an engineer." Noah looked around the community center. "It wasn't to finish projects. It was to protect the people who use them." Phoenix quietly sipped the hot chocolate. Sometimes he still couldn't understand why adults kept thanking him. To him, the choice had always seemed simple. If something felt dangerous, you warned people. That evening, as they walked back toward the shelter, Walter moved more slowly than usual. Halfway down the block, he stopped to catch his breath. Phoenix immediately waited. "You okay?" Walter smiled tiredly. "I've had a good life." Phoenix didn't like how that sounded. "You'll have more." Walter looked toward the setting sun, reflecting off distant buildings. "I hope so." Then he noticed a little girl pointing toward a broken section of sidewalk. Her mother barely glanced down before continuing to walk. Walter quietly smiled. "You see that?" Phoenix nodded. "The little girl noticed." "So did you." Walter's eyes filled with quiet satisfaction. "They're learning." Phoenix looked confused. "Who?" Walter rested one hand against the brass whistle hanging from his grandson's neck. "Everybody." For the first time in many years, the old firefighter believed the city had begun listening before the sirens started. And that was the kind of victory no newspaper headline could ever fully capture. Winter came earlier than expected that year. The first snow fell before Thanksgiving, covering the sidewalks of Philadelphia in a thin layer of white that softened the city's rough edges. Cars moved more slowly. People walked with their hands buried in coat pockets. Even the familiar sounds of buses and construction seemed quieter beneath the blanket of snow. Walter Price watched the snowfall from the shelter window. "It always makes the city look innocent," he murmured. Phoenix stood beside him. "But it isn't." Walter smiled gently. "No city is." He coughed hard enough that he had to steady himself against the windowsill. Phoenix immediately reached for his inhaler. Walter accepted it with a grateful nod. The medication helped, but not as much as it had a few months earlier. His lungs were losing the battle. Neither of them needed a doctor to explain that. Jonathan Mercer had quietly arranged for Walter to receive treatment from one of the best pulmonary specialists in the city. The appointments cost the old firefighter nothing. Transportation arrived on time every week, yet medicine could only slow time. It could not stop it. Walter understood that better than anyone. One afternoon, after another hospital visit, the doctor asked Phoenix to wait outside the examination room for a few minutes. The hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee from a vending machine nearby. Phoenix sat with the brass whistle in his hands, rubbing his thumb over its worn engraving. He watched nurses move quickly from room to room. Families smiled hopefully. Others cried quietly. Hospitals always held both endings at once. A few minutes later, Jonathan walked into the waiting area. He had just finished another meeting nearby and had stopped by to check on Walter. "How's your grandfather?" Phoenix looked toward the closed examination room door. "He keeps saying he's fine." Jonathan nodded. "My father used to say the same thing." "Was he sick?" "No. He just hated worrying people." Phoenix looked down again. "Grandpa worries me anyway." Jonathan sat beside him. "So do the people who love us." The examination room door opened. The doctor stepped out first. His expression remained professional, but his eyes carried the kind of sadness physicians learned to hide. Jonathan stood. The doctor recognized him immediately. "Mr. Mercer." Jonathan nodded politely. "How is he?" The doctor answered carefully. "We're keeping him comfortable." Phoenix understood those words. Children who grow up around illness often do. Comfortable meant there wasn't much left to fix. The ride back to St. Matthew's shelter felt unusually quiet. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the windshield. Walter watched them with peaceful eyes. "You know, I've always liked winter." Phoenix glanced at him. "Because of Christmas?" Walter smiled. "No. Because everything slows down. People finally notice one another." That evening, Walter asked Phoenix to bring him the old green toolbox, the same one he had opened months earlier. Phoenix carried it carefully onto the bed. Walter lifted out photographs one by one. Engine Company 18, his academy graduation, his late wife smiling beside a red pickup truck. Then he found a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Firefighter Rescues, 5 Children from Apartment Fire." Phoenix had seen the article before. "What made you save them?" Walter laughed softly. "I was young. I didn't think. You always tell me to think." "I know." Walter looked at the clipping. When you're inside a burning building, you don't choose who deserves saving. You just move. He closed the box again, then removed the brass whistle from around Phoenix's neck. For a long moment he simply held it, turning it slowly beneath the lamp. I've been carrying this almost 50 years. Phoenix stayed silent. Walter finally looked up. I think it's carrying you now. The old firefighter gently placed the whistle back around Phoenix's neck. This isn't about remembering me. It's about remembering why people speak. Phoenix felt tears forming. I don't want you talking like this. Walter smiled. I'm not saying goodbye. I'm giving instructions. Despite himself, Phoenix laughed through watery eyes. Of course you are. Walter squeezed his grandson's hand. Promise me something. Anything. If you ever see something wrong, don't wait because you are afraid people won't believe you. I promise. If they laugh, I'll still speak. If they ignore you, I'll still speak. Walter nodded. And one more thing. Phoenix leaned closer. When somebody else speaks, listen. The room fell quiet. Snow tapped gently against the shelter window. 2 days later, Walter asked to sit outside for a while. Jonathan arrived unexpectedly that afternoon, carrying hot chocolate for everyone. He found Walter wrapped in blankets beneath the shelter porch. The old firefighter smiled. I was hoping you'd stop by. Jonathan sat beside him. I've been meaning to ask you something. Walter chuckled. You've already asked all the important questions. Not this one. Jonathan looked toward Phoenix, who was helping shovel snow from the sidewalk with 2 younger children. How did you raise someone like him? Walter followed his gaze. I didn't. Jonathan looked puzzled. I simply tried not to teach him to stop caring. The answer lingered between them. After several quiet minutes, Walter spoke again. You know, I used to think my greatest rescue happened inside a burning building. He looked toward Phoenix. I was wrong. Jonathan waited. My greatest rescue was making sure that boy never believed kindness was weakness. Jonathan's eyes remained fixed on Phoenix. He doesn't. I know. Walter smiled peacefully. Then I did all right. That night, Walter fell asleep earlier than usual. Phoenix adjusted the blanket around his shoulders before turning off the bedside lamp. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, he woke to an unfamiliar silence. No coughing, no restless breathing, only stillness. He sat upright immediately. Grandpa. No answer. Phoenix reached for Walter's hand. It was cool, peaceful. The old firefighter's face carried the faintest smile, as though he had simply drifted into the deepest sleep of his life. Phoenix rested his forehead gently against his grandfather's hand. He didn't cry right away. Instead, he whispered the sentence they had repeated together for years. When people stop listening, his voice broke. Then, through tears that finally refused to stay hidden, he finished it alone. Don't stop warning. Outside dawn slowly colored the snowy streets of Philadelphia. Somewhere in the distance, a fire engine passed through the quiet city. Its siren echoed softly across the frozen morning. This time Walter Price was no longer answering the call, but the boy wearing his old brass whistle still would. Spring returned to Philadelphia with the gentle confidence of a city that had survived another winter. Cherry blossoms lined the sidewalks near Independence Mall. Children filled neighborhood parks again, and outdoor cafes slowly replaced heavy coats with open umbrellas and laughter. Nearly 1 year had passed since the morning Phoenix Price had run into traffic. The South Market neighborhood looked completely different. Fresh sidewalks stretched across the rebuilt blocks. New gas lines lay deep beneath reinforced foundations. Trees had been planted where temporary fencing once stood. Most people walking through the district had no idea how close the street had come to becoming a disaster. Phoenix knew. Every time he crossed that intersection, he instinctively slowed for a moment. Not out of fear, out of respect. He still wore Walter's brass whistle around his neck. Its surface had become smoother from constant use, but the faded engraving remained visible whenever sunlight caught it at the right angle. His own life had changed just as quietly as the neighborhood. After Walter's passing, Jonathan Mercer had worked with the shelter director and the city's family services department, not to adopt Phoenix or remove him from his community overnight, but to help him transition into a small, supervised housing program for independent youth. Jonathan had insisted on one condition. Nothing should make him feel like charity replaced his grandfather. Instead of expensive gifts, Phoenix received something Walter had always wanted for him: stability, a small bedroom with a desk beside the window, a bookshelf filled mostly with second-hand novels, a school only 4 blocks away, 3 regular meals, a place where he could leave his backpack without wondering whether it would still be there the next morning. It wasn't luxury, it was peace. Phoenix had returned to school after missing almost 2 years. The first months hadn't been easy. Math had changed. History lessons had moved ahead without him. He worried his classmates would only know him as the homeless boy from television. Instead, something unexpected happened. Most students didn't recognize him. The news cycle had already moved on. To them, he was simply the quiet, new kid who noticed things other people overlooked. One afternoon during science class, the teacher accidentally skipped over a loose electrical outlet hanging beneath the whiteboard. Everyone else walked past it. Phoenix quietly raised his hand. "I think someone should fix that before somebody trips." The teacher looked down. She smiled. "Good catch." Those 2 words meant more to Phoenix than she could possibly know. Good catch. Not, "You're imagining things." Not, "Stay out of it." Not, "Go away, kid." After school, Phoenix often walked to the Street Watch Voices office, which now occupied a modest brick building only a few blocks from City Hall. The office looked nothing like a corporate headquarters. There were no marble floors, no expensive artwork. Instead, walls were covered with neighborhood maps filled with handwritten notes, photographs, and colored pins, broken sidewalks, faulty traffic lights, flood-prone intersections, unsafe playground equipment. Every report remained visible until someone documented how it had been resolved. Emily Carter now directed the entire program. She greeted Phoenix every Tuesday afternoon with exactly the same question. "What did you notice this week?" Never, "What problem did you find?" Only, "What did you notice?" Because she had learned there was a difference. Some observations became problems, others prevented them. That Tuesday, Phoenix spread several photographs across the table. "The crossing signal outside Lincoln Elementary stays green too long for cars." Emily studied the pictures. "You timed it." He nodded. 4 mornings. She smiled. Walter would have been proud. Phoenix smiled back. "I hope so." Across the office, Noah Bennett led a meeting with several young engineers who had recently joined Mercer Urban Development. Most were fresh out of college. They expected discussions about concrete strength and drainage systems. Instead, Noah projected a single photograph onto the screen. It showed a barefoot 11-year-old standing in front of a limousine. No captions, no explanation. One engineer finally asked, "Who's the kid?" Noah folded his arms. "The best safety inspector I've ever worked with." The room chuckled politely, assuming he was joking. He wasn't. For the next hour, Noah never discussed calculations. Instead, he taught them how to walk through neighborhoods without looking only at blueprints. Watch where children avoid stepping. Notice which trees suddenly stop attracting birds. Ask the store owners what changed. Listen before measuring. By the end of the session, Every young engineer understood they had enrolled in a profession that required curiosity as much as mathematics. Meanwhile, Jonathan Mercer had quietly transformed his own schedule. A year earlier, nearly every hour had belonged to investors, executives, and city officials. Now the first Thursday morning of every month remained permanently blocked on his calendar. No meetings, no conferences, no interviews. Only one entry: neighborhood walk. Without cameras or announcements, Jonathan visited one community each month. Sometimes Phoenix joined him. Sometimes he didn't. On one particularly warm afternoon, the two of them walked through South Market together. Children rode bicycles where construction equipment had once stood. Street musicians performed beside newly planted flower beds. The city finally sounded alive again. Jonathan stopped near the exact spot where Phoenix had shouted a year before. "You know, I've replayed that morning 1,000 times." Phoenix looked at the pavement. "So have I." Jonathan smiled. "I always wonder what would have happened if you hadn't run." Phoenix answered quietly. "I wonder what would have happened if you'd kept walking." Jonathan looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You listened." The billionaire shook his head. "Not at first." "But you did." Phoenix looked toward the rebuilt street. "A lot of people don't." Jonathan remained silent. He knew the boy wasn't criticizing him. He was reminding him. Before leaving, Jonathan reached into his coat pocket. Phoenix laughed. "If that's another envelope." Jonathan laughed too. "It isn't." He handed over a small brass key. "What is it?" "The first key to our new community observation center." Phoenix turned it over in his hand. "You want me to keep it?" Jonathan nodded. "It doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the people who notice." Phoenix closed his fingers around the key, then instinctively touched the whistle resting against his chest. One represented the past. The other represented the future. Together they reminded him that doors opened much more easily when people first learned how to listen. As the afternoon sun settled over the rebuilt neighborhood, Jonathan quietly realized something Walter Price had understood long before he ever became a billionaire. Strong cities weren't built only with concrete and steel. They were built by ordinary people who cared enough to pay attention before someone else got hurt. 2 years later, Philadelphia hardly remembered the morning an entire street had been sealed off. News stories had faded. Television crews had moved on. People naturally made room for newer headlines, newer emergencies, newer heroes. Phoenix Price preferred it that way. He was 13 now, taller than before, though still lean from years of growing faster than his appetite. His backpack had been replaced twice, but Walter's brass whistle still rested against his chest every single day. Some things were never meant to be outgrown. On the first Saturday of October, Streetwatch, Voices organized its annual neighborhood walk. There were no speeches, no politicians, no ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Just volunteers spreading across different neighborhoods to notice things that usually went unnoticed. Children walked beside engineers. Retired teachers partnered with firefighters. Delivery drivers compared notes with architects. Jonathan Mercer insisted on joining every year, not as the company's CEO, simply as Jonathan. That morning, Phoenix had been assigned to the area surrounding Philadelphia's 30th Street station. Thousands of people crossed the sidewalks every hour. Tourists dragged rolling suitcases. Students hurried toward buses. Street musicians competed with train announcements echoing across the plaza. Phoenix enjoyed busy places. Patterns became easier to see when many people moved through the same space. Around noon, he noticed a small boy standing alone near a pedestrian crossing. The child couldn't have been older than 10. He wore an oversized green jacket despite the mild weather and clutched a plastic grocery bag containing everything he apparently owned. The boy wasn't looking at traffic. He kept staring toward a temporary construction barrier beside the station entrance. Then he looked down, then back toward the barrier. Again and again. Phoenix slowed. He had seen that look before. Not fear, observation. The boy suddenly stepped toward a nearby police officer. "Excuse me, sir." The officer barely glanced down. "Stay behind the cones, buddy." "I know. But that metal fence keeps moving. It's supposed to." "No." The boy hesitated. "It's moving by itself." The officer smiled politely without really listening. "I'm sure it's fine." He turned to answer a question from another pedestrian. The child stepped back. Disappointed, Phoenix's heart tightened. For just a second, he was 11 again, standing outside the South Market construction fence, trying to explain something adults couldn't yet see. He walked over quietly. "Hi." The younger boy looked up. "My name's Phoenix." "I'm Leo." Phoenix smiled. "What did you notice?" Leo pointed toward the temporary barrier. "The ground shakes every time the buses stop." Phoenix watched for a moment. A city bus pulled alongside the curb. Passengers climbed off. As the bus pulled away, the barrier vibrated noticeably. Not dangerous. Not yet. But unusual. Phoenix walked closer. One support post had loosened from the concrete base. If enough pedestrians leaned against it during rush hour, the entire section could collapse into the work zone. Not catastrophic, but someone could certainly be hurt. Phoenix waved toward one of the site supervisors. The man was busy speaking on his phone. He didn't notice. Phoenix didn't give up. He walked directly to the safety office trailer. A young engineer stepped outside. "Can I help you?" Phoenix pointed toward the fence. "The south support post is loose." The engineer frowned. "You sure?" "No. I'd rather you be." Without another word, the engineer grabbed a wrench and walked over. He knelt beside the barrier. His expression changed immediately. He called another worker. Within minutes, maintenance tape surrounded the area while crews reinforced the entire section. The engineer returned, smiling. "Good catch." Phoenix smiled back. "Actually," he looked toward Leo. He noticed it. The engineer walked over to the younger boy. "Thank you." Leo looked surprised. "You believed me?" The engineer laughed. "I've learned that's usually the smart choice." Jonathan Mercer had witnessed the entire exchange from across the plaza. He hadn't interrupted. He simply watched. Emily Carter stood beside him. That looked familiar. Jonathan smiled softly. It was. He watched Phoenix kneel until he was eye level with Leo. The older boy reached beneath his shirt and carefully removed Walter's brass whistle. For a long moment, he simply held it in both hands. Its worn surface reflected the afternoon sunlight. The whistle had traveled through nearly half a century. From a firefighter to a homeless child. Through fear, through loss, through courage, through hope. Phoenix looked at Leo. "My grandpa gave this to me." Leo stared at it. "It's old." "It is. Does it still work?" Phoenix nodded. He raised it gently to his lips. One clear note echoed across the station plaza. Not loud, not dramatic. Just enough to make several people glance around. Phoenix smiled. "It still works." He carefully placed the whistle into Leo's hands. The younger boy immediately tried giving it back. "I can't take this." "You can. But it's yours." Phoenix gently closed Leo's fingers around it. "It belonged to someone who taught me something important." "What?" Phoenix looked directly into the boy's eyes. "When people stop listening..." Leo waited. Phoenix smiled exactly the way Walter always had. "Don't stop warning." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Leo nodded slowly. "I won't." Jonathan felt something catch in his throat. He remembered the first time he had seen that whistle. An 11-year-old homeless boy had been clutching it while standing in front of a black limousine. Back then, Jonathan had seen only an old piece of brass. Now he understood it had never been about the whistle. It had always been about permission. Permission to speak. Permission to care. Permission to believe that ordinary people could protect one another. As Phoenix stood up, Jonathan walked over. "You gave away your grandfather's whistle." Phoenix looked at Leo, who still held it carefully with both hands. "I kept what mattered." Jonathan smiled. "And what's that?" Phoenix looked across the busy station where strangers continued hurrying past one another. "The courage to listen." Jonathan followed his gaze. Around them, the city moved exactly as it always had. People rushing to work, children laughing, buses arriving, construction continuing. Life never stopped. But somewhere among those thousands of ordinary people walked a few who had learned to pay attention. A retired firefighter's lesson had outlived the firefighter. A homeless boy had become a young man without ever forgetting where he came from. A billionaire had discovered that leadership began with listening rather than speaking. And a small brass whistle had completed its journey, not by remaining in one pair of hands forever, but by reminding each new owner that the smallest voice in a crowd might one day save the greatest number of lives. The city had not become perfect. It never would. But it had become a place where one more child believed that speaking up mattered. Sometimes that was how the biggest changes in the world truly began. Life rarely changes because of one extraordinary person. More often it changes because an ordinary person chooses not to stay silent. Phoenix never had wealth, influence, or authority. What he had was the courage to pay attention when everyone else was distracted, and the strength to speak when everyone else assumed someone else would. Walter understood that true heroes are not defined by uniforms or titles, but by the quiet decisions they make when no one is watching. Jonathan learned that leadership is not about having the loudest voice in the room. It is about making sure the quietest voices are heard before it is too late. Perhaps someone around you has been trying to tell the truth in a voice that is easy to overlook. A child, an elderly neighbor, a janitor, a cashier, or someone the world passes by every day. Sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the people with the fewest reasons to expect anyone will listen. If this story touched your heart, carry its lesson with you. Notice a little more. Listen a little longer. Speak up when something feels wrong. A single act of attention can protect a stranger, strengthen a community, and inspire another person to do the same. If this story meant something to you, we'd love to know where you're watching from and what lesson stayed with you the most. Share it in the comments so others can read your thoughts. If you'd like more stories about courage, kindness, and ordinary people changing lives in extraordinary ways, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next journey.